Rip in Time is the story of a man from 1787 who manages to accidentally travel through time to the year 2022, where he finds himself very confused and apparently homeless. His home is now owned by organic farmer Sarah Majors, who offers him shelter while he's figuring things out. But is it really possible to travel through time, or is Rip just a con artist? The movie begins with Sarah, Calvin, and Henry working on their farm. As they're lining the vegetable crops with copper pennies, Calvin tries to convince Henry that it's because they're actually space pods built by tiny astronauts, and that the pennies would act as microelectron converters which would help the astronauts form a force field against space monsters. But Henry doesn't seem amused. Despite being a child, he's quite mature for his age, and he sees right through Calvin's story. And he confidently informs him that he's not a child. In the next scene, Sarah puts dinner in the pressure cooker while Calvin informs her that Henry is done with the space invaders and is now working with the pterodactyls. And upon her surprise, he clarifies that he's in the chicken coop. He also expresses his amazement over how fast Henry is growing, that make-believe stories don't even impress him anymore. As for Henry, he's busy feeding the chickens when he spots a tall, dark figure near the turnips. But as he draws closer, he finds that it's a man devouring raw turnips. He lets out a sudden gasp. However, upon Henry's inquiry, the shabby-looking man confirms that he's not a robber and is in fact unarmed. He even claims that he's a man of honor. But Henry is still dumbfounded and proceeds to call his mother. Sarah rushes out to Henry, who informs her that there's an intruder in the barn. He also asserts that though the man looks homeless, he is non-threatening. Sarah, though, is appalled simply at the idea of Henry even conversing with a strange man in the barn. She also calls out to her dad as she heads inside the barn, gun in hand. She immediately threatens the man with the gun. The man tries to plead, but he is even more taken aback when she turns on the lights. Flabbergasted, he asks her if she's a witch, and Henry pipes in to inform him that she was, in fact, a witch for Halloween. The man apologizes profusely and begs Sarah not to shoot him. He asserts that he hit his head and is rather confused about what's happening himself. He then inquires if he can speak to her husband, but she refuses, and Henry quickly informs him that he's dead. The man apologizes again and explains that he understands that Sarah is a spinster forced to wear pants like a man to protect her family. However, Sarah is definitely offended and threatens him not to come any closer. She also urges Henry to go in and bring Calvin. But Henry doesn't want to miss any of the action and claims that he can't leave her alone. So, Sarah continues yelling for her dad and heads in herself. As the two enter the house, Calvin callously tells them that dinner's ready. But Henry is quick to inform him of the homeless man's presence, much to his alarm. Sarah tells him how he seems to have hit his head and that she thinks he's quite harmless. In fact, she tells him that she might actually need a first aid kit instead of the gun. Calvin agrees but tells her to have Ted, the local sheriff, promptly come over. Sarah reassures him that the man just seems lost and confused. And Henry adds that he must have been very hungry because he was eating raw turnips. So, the family heads out with a bowl of stew for the man in the barn, who gulps it down readily, exclaiming that it's the best stew he's ever had. He then informs them that his name is Rip, but he can't seem to recall his last name. Sarah also introduces herself and her family. Rip tells him that his mind has been foggy since he woke up and he can only remember bits and pieces of what happened. The countryside and landmarks seem familiar to him, but not quite at the same time. Sarah asks him where he's from, but he tells her that this is where he's from. Calvin suspects that Rip might have been related to their neighbors who had a boy in the military. And upon asking, Rip readily admits that he served in the military. Ted also arrives at the scene and asks if everything is okay. Sarah reassures him that there's nothing to worry about. But Henry pipes in and claims that a robber is living in their barn. At this, Sarah sternly tells him to go back inside the house. Then Sarah explains that it just seems to be their neighbor's veteran son. She also adds that she suspects he has PTSD, but that he's quite harmless. Rip comes out of the barn as well and informs Ted that he's not dangerous. He asks him if he's from the local constabulary, and Ted responds that he's from the sheriff's office. Sarah tells him that Ted might be able to help him figure out his situation. However, Rip is genuinely surprised by Ted's car and asks him why it doesn't have any horses. But Ted mockingly responds that he has tiny horses under the hood. Eventually, Rip gets in the back of the car and Sarah wishes him good luck. Ted snickers at the name Rip and Calvin comments that he seems jealous. Sarah, though, clears the air and claims that there's obviously nothing to be jealous about since they literally just found him in the barn. She also explains how he might have hit his head, which is why he doesn't seem to remember anything. It's obvious that Ted likes Sarah, so he reassures her that he'll get Rip's fingerprints to help him remember who he is. He then proceeds to tell her about a new restaurant in the area and how he'd like to take her there. But Calvin interrupts to coldly remind him that he has a man with a possible concussion that he should deal with before planning dates. And Ted finally drives off, telling Sarah that he'll call her later. At the hospital, Rip is startled by all the sounds, but Ted tries to pacify him and tells him that it's just a hospital. However, the doctor soon informs them that there are no signs of a concussion or head trauma, and Rip seems just fine, apart from the fact that he's obviously very confused. Ted also admits that his fingerprints don't match anyone in their database. Nevertheless, the doctor tells him that Rip needs to stay in the hospital for observation overnight. The next morning, as Sarah is tending to the farm, Rip pops in again. Sarah is somewhat startled by his sudden appearance, but he insists that he wants to work off the meal that they provided him. Henry tries to dump his own chores onto him, but Sarah disapproves. She asks Rip if he's better now, and Rip responds with how things are quite magical, and he actually feels like this might be heaven. At this, Sarah chuckles and informs him that her dad would probably not be here if it was heaven. Calvin then takes Rip to milk the cows, and it appears that he doesn't know anything about a milking machine either. Sarah proceeds to prepare breakfast for everyone, including Rip, who is astonished to discover the concept of veganism. Still, he points out that the apple trees need trenching and pruning, to which Sarah responds that it's more work than they can handle, which is why they haven't gotten around to it yet. Their farmhand left and they don't have a replacement. And Rip volunteers to help instead, but Ted shows up before Sarah has a chance to answer. Ted informs Sarah that they ran Rip's mugshots and fingerprints through their database, and nothing came up, not even in the military archive. Hence, they have no idea about who Rip actually is, and thus, he thinks that he can't be trusted. However, Sarah reassures him that Rip is just a veteran with some form of trauma, so he shouldn't be sent to jail. Ted tells her that he won't really go to jail unless she wants to register a trespassing complaint, which she blatantly refuses. She agrees, though, that he might need help at a psych hospital, but that he can stay at the farmhand house for a few more days until everything's sorted. She points out that her family would be very worried about him, but Ted disagrees. He doesn't think that Rip should stay for long, especially considering his situation. However, Sarah shuts him down, telling him that he wouldn't want Rip to be institutionalized if he was his family. Ted admits defeat and tells Sarah that she's too nice and that she should stay cautious and lock her door. Also, that she should call immediately even at the slightest hitch of trouble. And before he leaves, he prompts an answer for the restaurant date again, and this time Sarah awkwardly agrees. Sarah and Calvin try to find something about Rip on the internet. They find an article about their neighbor's son who received a Medal of Honor for a war. Upon asking, Rip confirms that he also received an honorary medal for the war. But it's hard to match Rip with the man in the picture, because he has such long hair and a beard. So, they decide to get him a shave and haircut, and although Rip is initially skeptical about the clippers, Sarah manages to calm him down. And much to their dismay, Rip looks nothing like their neighbor's son. Sarah then tries to coax more information from him about the war wherein he was wounded, and he confidently informs him that he fought the British in Delaware. Just then, Waylon pops in, and it's clear that he has some sort of unspoken rift with Calvin. Upon hearing about Rip's war, he assumes that he's referring to reenactments, and informs him that he's also very into that time period. However, Rip is quite offended by his comment and claims that they had to fight against their own people during the war, and it was so intense, so how could Waylon claim to enjoy it? And Sarah decides they should leave before the situation escalates any further. Once they're outside, Rip apologizes for offending Waylon, but Calvin assures him that he's a know-it-all and that he'll even claim that he led the American Revolution, if you let him. But Rip tells them that he doesn't look anything like General Washington, who actually led the troops. And for a moment, both Sarah and Calvin are unsure whether Rip is putting on an act or if he really thinks he fought in the American Revolution War. Back at the farm, Rip gets right to work, and this prompts Calvin to consider hiring him as a farmhand. But Sarah reminds him that they can't afford to hire him and that they shouldn't take advantage of his situation. However, Calvin assures her that he's thinking long-term, so they ask him, and he agrees. They then take him to the farmhand house, and he claims that it's actually his house. Sarah is a bit taken aback and tells him that maybe it just looks similar. But Rip is adamant and, in fact, quite disappointed that the inside of the house is not the way he left it. So much so, he points at markings in the wood and tells the family that it's his initials that he engraved. Everything slowly comes back to him, and he announces his name as Rip Van Winkle II, and that he was born in 1758. The entire family is shocked, to say the least, and they tell Rip that he can't be alive in 2022. And now it's Rip's turn to be surprised. He tells them that it's 1789. He's truly bewildered and faints. However, he wakes up not long after and tells them that he had a strange dream where he was suddenly in 2022. And then as reality dawns on him again, he collapses a second time. But the next time he awakens, Calvin is already prepared and hands him a book with the story of Rip Van Winkle. Sarah and Calvin think reading the story would help him take everything in. And when Rip's done reading, he tells them that it's his father's story. They try to convince him that it's merely a folktale, but Rip's adamant. Rip then proceeds to tell them all about his father and how he had no ambition. This drove his mother crazy, and his father eventually disappeared. Unfortunately, though, this left Rip feeling lonely, with the entire burden of his father's farm resting on his young shoulders. So, he developed a strong hatred for his father and was determined not to be like him. At 17, he was recruited for the war and fought to free America. Many lives were lost in the movement, but Rip, despite being wounded, survived to tell the tale. As time passed, his mother passed away and his sister was married off, and he was left alone again, with only the farm that he had to tend every day. And during all of this, his hatred for his father only grew. However, one day, Rip Van Winkle Sr. returned, much to everyone's surprise. In fact, it seemed that he just appeared out of thin air. And when asked about his disappearance, he came up with a very far-fetched story about a magic cave, a bottle of brandy, and a thunderstorm that somehow swept him into a 20-year slumber. Of course, Rip didn't believe a word of the outlandish tale, and he even set out to disprove his father. But things didn't exactly go according to plan. He hiked past Cotterskill Point, all the way to the mountain ridge, and actually found a mineral cave like the one his father had described. The clouds started thundering too, which forced him to seek shelter inside the cave and take a swig of the brandy to keep himself warm. After that, he fell into a slumber and awoke very hungry. But when he stepped out of the cave, things seemed different. The landscape seemed to have been altered somehow. And then, Rip explained how he met Henry in the barn. Once he's finished telling his story, Henry informs him that it's even crazier than Calvin's alien stories, which is saying something. Neither Sarah nor Calvin or Henry seem to believe Rip's story, but they all collectively decide to retire for the night. Sarah runs into Ted the next morning, and he tries to convince her to press charges and get rid of Rip. He thinks that Rip is a threat, especially because his record's not checking out. But Sarah reassures him that Rip is very polite and completely harmless. As for Henry, he faced bullying at school because of Rip and he's pretty pissed. Rip approaches him in an attempt to pacify him. Henry confesses that he hates Wiley because he's a bully, and how he wishes he could teach him a lesson. Rip tells him that big doesn't always mean strong, and there's always a way to use your enemy's size against them. And he even promises to teach Henry how to defend himself. That sets his mood straight, and he thanks Rip for the offer. Rip's also a hit at the farmer's market, with ladies lining up at Sarah's stall to buy homemade butter just to get a chance to talk to Rip. And for the most part, it seems the Rip is finally starting to adjust and blend in with everyone. At night, after putting Henry to sleep, Rip and Sarah sit together on the porch. Sarah shows him a game on her phone and he tells her all about how they used to actually make their own toys when he was a kid. In fact, he grabs a blade of grass and toots it as a demonstration. It really sends Sarah into a laughing fit and she genuinely seems impressed. She asks him to teach her, and he obliges. And the two really seem to bond well. And as time passes, Rip also starts to befriend Henry. He starts teaching him basic combat using fake swords so he can defend himself. His help around the farm also proves invaluable, and Sarah specifically thanks him for it. They also candidly chat for a bit, and Rip expresses how societal norms have changed so much over the years. He also appreciates Sarah for how she handles everything perfectly, just like a man, if not better. And Sarah reveals that she booked an appointment for Rip in New York if he's comfortable seeking help, to which he agrees. However, they're interrupted by Henry, who hands Rip a toy tractor so he can get used to it, and won't be afraid of a real tractor, and it seems the two have really bonded well. Soon after, Sarah and Rip head to New York and find that it has changed significantly since they've been there. The psychiatrist hypnotizes Rip to better understand his condition and expresses that the case is extremely fascinating, considering Rip was able to maintain his delusions even under strict hypnosis. She runs a few tests just to be sure and discovers a foreign object in one of the X-ray reports. Rip is operated on under anesthesia, and the object turns out to be a bullet, that one from 1820. However, they brush it off as an elaborate reenactment stunt of the American Revolution. Rip and Sarah go for a stroll in the city, and Sarah finally shares her own story with Rip. She tells him about her parents and her baby daddy, and why she's so passionate about working at the farm to produce what she calls real food. And Rip expresses how he's proud that the war he fought to liberate America actually bore fruit. He realizes that their sacrifices were not in vain because America has become so marvelous. The next day, the doctor claims that there's no probable explanation for Rip's condition, which leads her to believe that his story about traveling through time might actually be true. In fact, she redirects them toward a quantum theory expert, Dr. Silver, who has a better explanation to offer. Dr. Silver informs them that they were able to formulate an equation that theoretically proves Rip's story. He explains that there exists some sort of connection between elemental particles across time, and that an energetic wormhole due to the lightning bolt in the mineral cave could have resulted in a time fold that brought Rip all the way to the future. He also believes that it's theoretically possible to reverse the event. But what Sarah is more concerned with is that Rip's story is apparently real, though she really can't bring herself to fully believe it. On their way back, Rip thanks Sarah for both bringing him here and for taking him and his story seriously. He tells her that she's a genuinely kind and generous person and that he can't thank her enough. He also confesses that he's actually starting to settle in, and some days at the farm, he doesn't even want to go back home. Back at home, Ted is still adamant about getting rid of Rip because he thinks that he's some sort of con artist that's going to scam Sarah and her family. He tells her that Rip is probably lying about everything and that he's heard of loads of similar stories, wherein con artists target easy marks and take advantage of them. However, Sarah seems rather offended by his comments and how he considers Calvin and her to be so gullible. She sends him off, but he tells her that they'll meet at the upcoming town festival. At the festival, Rip and Sarah take to the dance floor. Rip is yet again amazed by how the sound system's playing music without any real musicians. Sarah tells him to just give in to the beat and let his body take over. He gives it a try too, but eventually requests the DJ for a slower tune. Rip and Sarah take to the dance floor again, until they're interrupted by Ted. Ted takes Sarah by the hand and guides her to the dance floor, but her eyes never leave Rip, and she smiles to herself, just replaying their little moment in her head. In the meantime, Rip heads over to Calvin's defense, wherein he's being bullied by Waylon. Waylon claims to be selling ancient tools, but it appears that he's got it all wrong. He doesn't know a thing about what is what, and Rip points it out. He exposes Waylon in front of everyone, who then pretends to be occupied with a phone call, leaving Calvin feeling smug. Calvin can't stop talking about Waylon's face even when they're back home, but he heads to bed anyways. As for Sarah, she pulls Rip aside for a little privacy, and the two of them share an intimate moment on the porch. However, a very jealous Ted looks over at them from the shadows. As soon as Rip heads into the farmhand house, Ted follows suit and threatens him. He manipulates him into thinking that he's ruining things for Sarah, Henry, and Calvin by making a joke out of their reputation. He confesses that he loves Sarah and that Rip doesn't really have anything to offer any of them. Rip tries to reason with him at first, but eventually, his words start getting to him. Ted ends by harshly telling Rip that he doesn't belong here and that he should go back to where he came from. He tells him that if he actually cares for Sarah, then he should do the right thing and go back, because Sarah is too kind to express how much of a problem Rip's presence is for her. But as he tells Rip that he doesn't have a future here, Rip shuts him off by telling him to leave. Nevertheless, he can't stop wondering if he's actually being a nuisance to the family. The next morning, it's pouring. But besides that, everything seems normal. Sarah makes breakfast for everyone and they all start their morning like every other day. But Rip can't help the news, which mentions that the precipitation levels are unusually high because of the storm. Sarah drops Henry off at school and goes on to run some errands with Calvin. However, when they all return, they find Rip gone. He's nowhere to be found. But then Calvin spots a note on the mantelpiece. It's a goodbye note from Rip, apologizing for all the inconveniences he's caused them all. He also thanks them for their hospitality before bidding a final farewell. Sarah struggles to fight the tears as she reads the note, and as soon as she's done, they all rush to stop Rip from leaving. On their way to the cave, the path starts becoming steeper and steeper, and Henry and Calvin are unable to keep up, which is why they decide to go back rather than slow Sarah down. As for Sarah, she's determined to find Rip no matter what. She goes around, wildly calling for him until she finally finds him inside the cave. Rip is surprised to find her out in the storm, but she ignores it and confronts him about the letter. He confesses that Ted opened his eyes to the truth and that he doesn't want to hurt them all anymore, and that this is his only chance to get back home. But as they stand and stare, their feelings become too much to hold inside, and Rip confesses his undying love for Sarah by proposing. Sarah chuckles and tells him that they don't have to get married just yet, but they can start dating. Suddenly, they're interrupted by thunder crashing, and find that Rip's bag is gone from the cave. However, they have everything they need right there at that moment, and they both decide to return back to the farm together because they've decided that that's where they belong. As for Rip's bag, it returns to the 18th century where his father finds it, reads his diary, and discovers that his son is happy and doing well. He smiles to himself as he reads it, and thus, it's a happy ending for everyone.